Hello, my name is Evan Haefeli. I'm a professor in the history department at Texas A&M University, and today I'm going to talk to you about the Restoration colonies that transformed colonial North America. Now, these colonies were the colonies that were founded during this so-called Restoration period of English history between 1660 and 1688. They later became the states of North Carolina, South Carolina, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Socially, politically, and especially religiously, these colonies were very different from the colonies that had been established earlier. And that has a lot to do with the fact of when they were created during this unusual period of English history known as the Restoration. Restoration refers to the return of the monarchy after it had been abolished during the English Revolution, which had been unleashed with the execution of King Charles I in 1649. Until 1660, his sons, Charles and James, had to flee abroad for safety, never knowing if they would ever be able to reclaim the throne, while a revolutionary commonwealth, ultimately headed by the victorious general Oliver Cromwell, ruled Britain, Ireland, and America. Fortunately for royalists, the English revolutionaries were unable to figure out how to create a republican government that would last. Soon after Oliver Cromwell died in 1649, they called for a convention of representatives from all around England, many of them former royalists or royalist sympathizers, who decided to invite Charles to return home and become King Charles II, which is exactly what he did in the spring of 1660. Now, the Restoration period did not last very long, only 28 years. Charles II died in 1685 without a legitimate heir, so his younger brother James, who had been the Duke of York, became King James II. However, he was not a very popular king, mostly because he had converted to Roman Catholicism and wanted all of his Roman Catholic subjects to enjoy religious toleration and some sort of equality with his Protestant ones. Rather than accept that, British elites conspired with the Dutch to stage a sort of coup. A Dutch army invaded England in the fall of 1688, claiming to restore England's rights that were being threatened by James II. Many English soldiers and elites sided with the Dutch against their king. Rather than fight, James fled to France, where he would spend the rest of his life. In what would later be called the Glorious Revolution, the commander of the Dutch army, Prince William of Orange, became King of England, Ireland, and Scotland in the spring of 1689. His wife, Mary, who was the eldest daughter of James II, became queen. Now, I'm not going to be talking about the Glorious Revolution or its consequences here, although they're very important. I just want to point out that the Restoration period was a short, strange period framed by two major tumults in English history. In the first, you had a revolution where the king was executed and the monarchy abolished, and the second, this glorious revolution where a king was driven from his throne and replaced by another king from a foreign country, namely Holland. So it's not the most politically stable period of English history. And furthermore, two of the key factors that ended up contributing to the Glorious Revolution are really essential for understanding this period and what happens with the Restoration colonies. First is religion, and especially the place of Roman Catholicism in a mostly Protestant world, and then also English relations with the Dutch. This short, tumultuous period is very important because it made early America a much more religiously, ethnically, and economically diverse place than it would have been otherwise, especially in the so-called middle colonies of the mid-Atlantic, what's now New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Pennsylvania became world famous for its religious freedom and multicultural population, and the many immigrants from outside of Britain and Ireland that made up its population, most of them from Germany. New York also became a place full of religious and ethnic diversity with lots of Dutch people, as well as Germans, French Huguenots, and others. Another distinctive legacy of this period is the arrival of thousands of Quakers to New Jersey and especially Pennsylvania, where they played an important role in shaping the region's culture and politics. Now, if you think about it for a second, it's really pretty extraordinary because Quakers were pacifists. They refused to serve in the military or to support military solutions to conflicts. Instead, they advocated for peace and peaceful means of resolving differences between peoples and nations. Now, these are very admirable qualities, but they're not the sort of qualities one usually looks for on the frontiers of an expanding empire. Can you think of any other empire that ever entrusted a big chunk of its frontier to pacifists? Only during the Restoration period was this possible. In the whole history of the British Empire, it did not happen before, and it would never happen again. Apart from the long-term consequences for American history, the Restoration era is also important for the ways that it changed the religious character of the British Empire. From the time of the Reformation until the Restoration, English people had been struggling over their national religion. A few regretted the Reformation and wanted the country to return to Roman Catholicism. Others, known as Puritans, wanted England to become even more completely Protestant than it already was. Anglicans were those who were happy with the distinctive character of the English church, which was Protestant, but not as purely Protestant as Puritans wanted it to be, because it kept the bishops and some ceremonies and other practices that resembled Roman Catholicism. Now, Anglicans claimed that they represented a reasonable middle between the radical extremes of Roman Catholicism on the one hand and Puritanism on the other. But for Puritans, that was exactly the problem. King Charles I had been had been the biggest supporter of these trends in Anglicanism, and that support is an important part of what had upset Puritans to the point that they had spearheaded the revolution that ultimately killed King Charles and abolished the monarchy. Now, politically, the revolution failed because the Puritans could not agree on a stable form of government. Religiously, the Puritans had the problem that while they knew what they did not like, which is basically Roman Catholicism and also this kind of Anglicanism, they could not agree on what they wanted. Most Puritans favored a new national church in the form of some kind of a Presbyterian church like you had in Scotland, but others, especially those living in New England, wanted a more decentralized congregational system. Now, these were differences more about church government than belief, because they shared many beliefs, but they could not agree on how to organize. But then there were others who were even more radical, like the Quakers, who were a new group that had emerged during the 1650s, or the Baptists, people who pretty much believed the same thing as Presbyterians and Congregationalists, except they rejected the practice of baptizing infants. Both Quakers and Baptists also didn't think that their ministers had to be highly educated individuals like Presbyterians and Congregationalists did. They also didn't think that the minister should have such a powerful and important role in local religious life. Because all of these different groups couldn't agree on a religious or political solution, the monarchy came back, and with it, the Church of England. However, the country that both the monarchy and the Church of England now presided over had been radically transformed. English Christianity was much more diverse than it had ever been before. And there were so many people committed to their particular religious visions that they were no longer willing to be part of an Anglican church, even though they were Protestant like the church. And that was a big problem because in theory, England was supposed to have just one church, just as it had just one king. People automatically became members of the church just as they were automatically subjects of the king by being born there, born within his territory. And since the monarch was also the head of the church, refusing to be part of the Church of England had always been regarded with suspicion as a kind of treason. And many people had been harshly punished, even executed, for refusing to accept the Church of the King in the century before the Restoration. Now, however, there were just way too many people belonging to way too many different kinds of churches to fit them all back into the national church. English Christianity was fractured into many different pieces. Some people, especially in Ireland, remained Roman Catholic. In England, Anglicans were the majority who benefited from having the official monopoly on religion. in England, Scotland, and Ireland, which was backed up by laws and as well as the power of the monarchy. However, a sizable majority of British Protestants refused to acknowledge the official church as their church, especially in the colonies, where the situation was even more drastic. Virginia, for example, adopted the restored Anglican Church, but even there, some Puritans refused to conform to it. In New England, where the vast majority of people were Congregationalists, the government refused to accept the official Church of England at all. These Protestants who refused to participate in the officially established Church of England now became known by a new name, dissenters. Dissenters were a very diverse group who did not always agree with each other. There were Puritans, Congregationalists, Baptists, and Quakers, all of whom had fought with each other and disagreed with each other before and would continue to do so going forward. However, they now had one important thing in common. They were Protestants who were not part of the established church. If they were going to be able to practice their religion without harassment and persecution, they were going to need some kind of toleration. The lack of religious unity made toleration one of the major religious and political issues of the Restoration era. Although for some people it made sense to use toleration to resolve the problem, many people opposed toleration, and laws were passed to force people back into the Anglican Church. However, those laws failed to get everybody to conform. Worse, they created martyrs for the different religious dissenters, when people suffered or even died as a result of their treatment by the authorities. And this was especially the case with the Quakers, who, as the most radical group, were also the most intensely persecuted. And the experience of persecution only made them more determined to stick to their faith and stay out of the Church of England. This situation was also the case in colonial America, where both Virginia and New England persecuted Baptists and Quakers who refused to conform to the official church. The only exceptions were the colonies of Maryland and Rhode Island. Now, Maryland was owned and governed by the Roman Catholic Calvert family, and Roman Catholics helped govern the colony and form much of its elite, even though they were a minority in the colony as a whole. But because the Roman Catholics were in charge, they could favor policies of toleration, which was really necessary for them if they're going to practice their religion in the Protestant-dominated English world. Rhode Island was a very different situation. It was a colony dominated by radical Protestants, Baptists, Quakers, and others who were really hard to put into any particular category. The one thing they had in common is they rejected all of the major churches out there. So instead of an official church, the colony had religious freedom. But it was a small, poor colony surrounded by powerful colonies that supported the Congregational Church. So Maryland and Rhode Island offered some religious tolerance, but they were not going to be able to transform early America into the religiously pluralistic landscape that it became. The push for greater religious diversity in early America came primarily from England, not the colonists, who mostly preferred to live in a religiously united community. There wasn't a deliberate plan or vision for making America a home for religious liberty, but that's exactly how it turned out, thanks to the politics behind the creation of the Restoration colonies, which were very much influenced by the controversies within England over whether to grant religious toleration or not, and if so, how much and to whom. Toleration is a legal issue, but also a very political one, because it's not entirely clear who had the power to make the decision to tolerate. The restored monarchy had a good deal of power and authority, but it still had to share that with Parliament. And it was Parliament that passed the laws and raised the taxes to enforce them. So Parliament's opinion was very important. And in the end, Parliament was unwilling to tolerate Roman Catholics, although it was willing to grant some toleration to Protestant dissenters. The kings of England, on the other hand, proved willing to extend toleration to include Roman Catholics. As a result, much of the Restoration period involved a struggle between the monarchy and Parliament over who would decide what to do about toleration and many other things. And it's not until after the Glorious Revolution that Britain becomes the mixed monarchy for which it's famous for being today, where monarchs shared their power with Parliament. Before then, and in the Restoration period, monarchs in England, like in much of the rest of Europe, were trying to acquire as much power to govern on their own as they could, without much interference from a parliament or some other similar House of Representatives. In some places, like Catholic Spain and France, they were quite successful at doing this. And others, like England, they were much less successful in doing that. Now here it's also important to remember that King Charles II and his younger brother, James, the Duke of York, had much more positive attitudes towards Roman Catholicism than most of their Protestant subjects, for a variety of reasons. They had a Roman Catholic mother. The King of France was their cousin. They had spent much of the 1640s and 50s living in Spanish or French territories. After the Restoration, Charles took a Portuguese Catholic as his queen, Catherine of Braganza. James's first wife was an Englishwoman, but she converted to Catholicism, and his second wife was an Italian Catholic. And around 1670, James himself went so far as to actually convert to Roman Catholicism as well, after his wife did. King Charles II, remained an Anglican for his whole life, but there's many stories claiming that he converted to Catholicism on his deathbed. For these men, Roman Catholicism represented order, stability, tradition, loyalty, and reliability, in contrast to the revolutionary, king-killing Protestantism of many of their English subjects. For many of those English subjects, however, Roman Catholicism represented tyranny and oppression. Much of their sense of their rights and liberties was linked to their Protestant religion and to their opposition to Roman Catholicism, which goes back to the days of the Reformation. So the struggles over religious toleration in Restoration England quickly became political struggles that had much bigger implications and consequences for the English Constitution and for the American colonies, because it's during these struggles and in the midst of these struggles, and partly because of these struggles, that the Restoration colonies were established. During the Restoration era, England rapidly strengthened and expanded its empire. It passed new laws to regulate imperial trade. It acquired Bombay in India. It created the Royal Africa Company to bring more slaves to the American colonies, to grow more sugar and tobacco. It fought 2 wars against the Dutch to control their trade with the colonies. And the first one, which was technically the Second Anglo-Dutch War, the English captured the colony of New Netherland, whose territory was transformed into the Middle Colonies. So one way or another, there were going to be more colonies during the Restoration period than there had been before. However, it's not inevitable that they would have as much religious toleration and diversity as they did. To understand why that happened, we have to go back to the political struggles in England. To begin with, when Charles II came back to England, he wanted to reward his loyal supporters, but he did not have many resources to do so. Now, since it was the king who granted the charters that allowed English people to set up new colonies in America, American colonies turned out to be his one reliable source of patronage for his friends. And so we see one of the first examples of this is in the Carolina colony. The colony originally concluded the territory that's now both South Carolina and North Carolina. And he granted it to 8 of his allies in 1663 as a proprietary colony for them to own and govern as they saw fit. Now, these proprietors were courtiers, not colonists. They weren't planning on going to America themselves. They just wanted to make money off of the colony. And since the religious situation in both England and America was still pretty uncertain, and they wanted to fill the colony with as many tax-paying colonists as possible so that they could turn a profit as quickly as possible, the Carolina proprietors opted for a policy of religious toleration, with the option of eventually setting up the Anglican Church. But for the Restoration period, there was no official church in Carolina, just religious liberty. This encouraged a lot of different people, from religious dissenters in Virginia to New Englanders, some Scots, and Anglicans from the Caribbean to move to the colony. And altogether, they quickly made slavery a cornerstone of its economy. So there's no clear correlation between toleration and slavery or abolition. The following year, in 1664, the English conquered New Netherland. King Charles II granted it to his younger brother James, the Duke of York, and so the place was named New York after his official title. Because many of the colonists were Dutch people who had their own church, and even the English people in the colony were dissenters, James favored a policy of religious toleration that allowed each town to choose its own religion. The governor and garrison were Anglican, but almost no one else was. And then, after James became a Catholic around 1670, not even all the governors or garrison were Anglicans. James allowed an Irish Catholic, Thomas Duncan, to become governor for a while, and some of the other officers in the colony were also Catholics. This continued after James became king in 1685, and New York was transformed from a proprietary colony into a royal colony. But before then, James also had his own allies and supporters that he wanted to reward. So after he got New York, he granted the lands between the Hudson and Delaware rivers to two of those friends, Sir George Carteret and John Lord Berkeley. Both of them were also partial proprietors of Carolina. They called the colony New Jersey after the English Channel Island where Carteret was from, and they allowed religious toleration in the colony for the same reasons that they had supported it in Carolina. They weren't interested in moving to the colony, they just wanted to make money off it and wanted to encourage immigration from as many different people as possible. By 1674, Berkeley decided that he would rather just sell off his share, so he sold it to two Quakers, Edward Billing and John Fenwick, who were interested in becoming colonists. And the following year, Fenwick led the first group of colonists, most of them Quakers, to set up the town of Salem in southern New Jersey. These Quakers then negotiated with Carteret to split New Jersey in two so that they could govern themselves. And thus, you have the creation of two colonies in New Jersey, an East Jersey, which was mostly northern New Jersey, and a West Jersey, which was mostly southern New Jersey. The Quakers of West Jersey quickly created a constitution that supported religious freedom and encouraged the immigration of several thousand Quakers to what's now southern New Jersey. So West Jersey was the first Quaker-controlled colony and Quaker-dominant colony in colonial America. In 1682, Carteret sold his share Carteret died, and his share in New Jersey was sold to a group of 12 proprietors, 11 of them Quakers. And so then East Jersey also became a Quaker-dominated colony. And so for the rest of the 1680s, you had two New Jerseys, each governed by Quakers and supporting religious liberty. Just before the Quakers gained control of East Jersey in 1681, William Penn was granted the colony of Pennsylvania, making for three colonies owned and governed by Quakers in the 1680s. In the case of New Jersey, the Quakers had negotiated with the proprietors who had received the colony from the king, so it's hard to say how involved King Charles had been in allowing them to gain control of the colony. But in the case of Pennsylvania, he gave the colony directly to William Penn, so there's no doubt that he knew what was going on in turning over this huge chunk of territory to a Quaker who was not only a pacifist, but also someone who would not support the established Church of England. To understand how King Charles could support the creation of a huge new colony controlled by a Quaker, we have to go back again to the English context where Charles's willingness to tolerate Catholics, as combined with James's conversion to Catholicism, was causing a huge controversy. Because Charles's marriage was not producing any legitimate children, and so it looked like, and in fact was the case, that the next person to become King of England was going to be the Roman Catholic James. People started to get really nervous in Parliament and outside of Parliament, and so they passed a series of laws known as the Test Acts in the 1670s, ordering that everyone who held any kind of office in the government, in the military, the church, or in Parliament had to swear an oath declaring their loyalty both to the monarchy and to the Church of England, and declare their rejection of basic Roman Catholic doctrines like transubstantiation. One of the reasons they did this is because James, the Duke of York, was also the Lord High Admiral of the English Navy. And the goal of this was to flush him out and force him to confess that he was actually a Catholic, or to give that up so that he could hold on to the office of Lord High Admiral. He didn't. He gave it up. He never publicly admitted that he'd converted, but it was pretty clear that this was a sign that he had a loyalty to this Roman Catholic religion, which was now officially banned from playing a role in the government. One result of this was this crazy moment in English history known as the Popish plot. As English Protestants became increasingly nervous about James's religion, they worried what would happen if a Catholic suddenly became king. This anxiety contributed to an outbreak of social and political hysteria that started just before Charles granted William Penn his colonial charter. It began in 1678 when a rumor started to circulate that there was a secret plot by Roman Catholics to kill the king. Now, the story was a little bit sketchy, but because people were so nervous about these religious and political issues, Parliament decided to launch an investigation of this so-called Popish plot. And for the next 2 years, dozens of people from England and Ireland were accused and investigated. And 22 of them, all Roman Catholics, were executed for being part of this plot, which in the end, there doesn't seem to be any real strong evidence for. And most historians think that the plot never actually existed, but people believed it did and acted as if it did. And what really mattered is that Protestants in Parliament took advantage of this hysteria to draw up a bill known as the Exclusion Bill, which would have excluded James from inheriting the throne by requiring that whoever became King of England or Queen of England had to be a professing Protestant. King Charles was furious because this challenged the most basic element of the monarchy, which was all about inherited power, wealth, and status. And if Parliament could decide who could inherit what, then England's monarchs would have very little authority left to them. So he fought this exclusion bill by using his powers to shut down Parliament and call new elections several times over. Unfortunately for him, every time he called a new election, he got a more radical Parliament that supported the exclusion bill even more strongly than the previous one. So he would dissolve the Parliament again and call another election. This happened several times until it looked like King Charles II might be losing control of the country. So it's right in the middle of this that William Penn puts in his request for a colony. As a leading Quaker, he'd already been involved in affairs with West Jersey, and that seemed to have sparked his desire to create an ideal society in America, one that had more religious freedom and political liberty than existed in England at the time. Now, Penn was a wealthy, well-connected man who was friends with some of the key supporters of the Exclusion Bill. He did not run for Parliament himself, but he helped campaign for them. However, Penn was also friends with King Charles. Penn's father was an admiral under Admiral Oliver Cromwell in the Puritan Revolution, and at the Restoration, his father had been in command of the ship that actually brought Charles from Holland to England. So he also knew James, and especially after James converted to Catholicism, they had a shared interest and common cause in favoring policies of religious toleration, which was one of the great causes of William Penn's life. So at this time when England was intensely polarized and breaking up into two groups that became the basis of its modern political parties, the Tories, who supported the authority of the king and the right of James to inherit the throne, even though he was a Catholic. They weren't totally happy about that. And the Whigs, who favored the authority of Parliament and the primacy of Protestantism over the ancient rights of kings to inherit their power. Penn was one of the very few people who had friends on both sides of the divide. He's a very peculiar figure who sympathized with elements of both causes and was neither a Whig nor a Tory. He was a Quaker, and he was willing to be loyal to whoever supported what Quakers needed, especially religious toleration. Accordingly, King Charles realized that if he granted Penn the colony, Penn would recruit as many of his Whig friends to support it. And since the colony depended on the king for its right to exist, these Whigs would have to stop supporting the Exclusion Bill. So instead of granting the colony to reward people who were already his friends and allies, like he'd done with Carolina, this time Charles granted the colony to create new friends and allies. And indeed, it seems to have worked. In the spring of 1681, just as Penn's application for his colony was going through the process, King Charles called another parliament, only this time it met at Oxford. The parliamentarians introduced another exclusion bill, but the support for it was not quite as strong as before, and Charles felt comfortable dissolving the parliament and refused to call another one for the rest of his reign. Instead, he was able to govern on his own for the last 4 years of his life. In the meantime, Penn went to America, followed by thousands of Quakers and many other immigrants, launching what became the most dynamic and innovative of all the English colonies in America. No one ever formally acknowledged that it had been granted as a political deal, but it really is impossible to understand its existence without understanding why the King of England would find it desirable to grant a colony to someone who would support neither his church nor his military abroad. Penn was a reliable political ally and sympathetic to the cause of a broad religious toleration, even for Catholics. And his colony gave a major boost to the economy of the empire. Now, all of this makes perfect sense in the tumultuous context of the Restoration, but only in the context of the Restoration. Nothing like it had happened before, nor would it ever happen again. The key thing to note about this is that none of these great colonial experiments in religious freedom, from Carolina to New York to New Jersey and Pennsylvania, was undertaken as an alternative to what was going on in England. Religious dissenters, especially the Quakers, were trying to get away from laws that persecuted them in England, but those were laws passed by Parliament. King Charles and James were willing to support religious toleration, but they did not have the control over the laws in England. In America, however, where the monarch was the sole unquestioned source of political authority, he could permit the creation of colonies that supported religious liberty instead of the monopoly of the Church of England. And Charles was willing to do so because in the very specific context of the Restoration, people like Quakers, and especially the influential William Penn, seemed to be more politically loyal than other English Protestants, including many Anglicans. Now, this phenomena didn't last very long. James II was only king for 3 years, but his efforts to promote the toleration of Roman Catholics, which William Penn actually returned to England in order to campaign in support of, proved so obnoxious to both the Tories and the Whigs that they finally united to kick James off the throne, and eventually in 1701 Parliament passed a new law saying that England's monarchs had to be Protestants, and that law is still in effect to this very day. So without the odd circumstances of the Restoration then, I think it's fair to say that there would be no Pennsylvania, and that American liberty and religious diversity would have been a lot less than what it ultimately turned out to be.